Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Demai, chapter 5, Halacha 3, in the Art Scroll 44b1. Very, very interesting Mishnah and Gemara, and very, very rich with a lot of detail. This Mishnah and Gemara is like a diamond with a lot of facets. So, just to talk about what this is going to be covering, this is going to be talking about the law for tithing loaves of bread that have been supplied by different people. And we're not sure a couple of things. One is some of the bread might be actual tevel, where the Am Haaretz didn't take out Truma Gedola at all. And some of it might be chulin. And you might actually have a mixture of some of each. Now, I want to talk about a basic rule of tithing. Now, the Trumos in 1.5 in the Mishnah over there is going to say that with regards to tithes, you're taking it out from that which is obligated for that which is exempt, or from that which is exempt for that which is obligated. And you can't do that. Okay? You can't mix up these tithes. All right? So let me just explain it real quick. So over there in the Mishnah, it's basically explaining that if a person has two things of produce, one is going to be chulin, the other is going to be tevel. You can't designate some of the chulin as meiser for the tevel. And if you're going to do that, the produce you're going to intend to end up trying to tithe remains forbidden as tevel. And then the designated portion ends up still being chulin. You didn't actually rectify anything. And in the same way, if you're going to try to designate some tevel as meiser on behalf of chulin, it's not going to take effect. And then the portion that you set aside as meiser, it ends up still being forbidden as tevel. You didn't actually do it. Now, that's over there where we're talking about Doraita tevel or chulin. Over here, we're talking about Demai. And it's relevant over here because under biblical law, you can assume that all Demai has been tithed, but the rabbis are decreeing that we're going to consider the possibility that the produce was not tithed. And so it would follow that if someone brought Demai from two different Am Haaretzes, and one of the portions is going to be suspect to different tithing obligations. In other words, one Am Haaretz might have separated tithes, just like the majority of the Am Haaretzim do. And that's going to make it so that the Demai is going to be exempt from tithing under biblical law. But the other might have not been separated at all. And then the Demai is going to be subject to the biblical tithing obligation. And he has to take out the Truma Gedola. In other words, let's say you're buying from two Am Haaretzes. Well, what if one of the Am Haaretzes is following the minority and didn't take out Truma Gedola at all? Well, then you have a Doraita issue. So over here, you could have it where one Am Haaretz might have separated the tithes and the other one didn't. And then the buyer may not end up separating tithes from one portion of the Demai on behalf of the other, even though the Demai enactment is going to require that both be tithed under rabbinic law. Why? Because he might be tithing produce that is Doraita obligated for produce that is biblically exempt, or vice versa. That, by the way, you can see in the commentary in Rashi, Baba Metzia 56a. In other words, one of the issues you have here is if you have something that's Doraita obligated and something that's D'Rabbanan obligated, you can't tithe one for the other. Why? Because this one didn't have the Truma Gedola taken out, and this one probably did. And so you end up with a big mess if you're having two different sources, even for Demai. And it's coming from Am Haaretzes. So there's a lot of richness here. And the Gemara, the Mishnah is going to be talking about three different opinions. You're going to have one, which is going to be Rabbi Meir, one is going to be Rabbi Yehuda, and one's going to be Rabbi Shimon. And really, it's going to look at a few different subjects. One is going to be what happens if you have tamei bread, and that's going to be a possibility. Another is going to be, well, what happens if you're really talking about different suppliers? And then what's going to be happening if, as an even more refined opinion with what Rabbi Shimon is saying, is he's basically going to be saying perhaps each of the different varieties of bread or pastries at this bakery might have come from many different suppliers in general, because different confectionaries are going to require different kinds of flour to pull off. And so you might have many, many different kinds of suppliers. So you might have two issues going on. One is going to be, well, perhaps some of the bread could be Demai, and some of it might not be Demai. And then another issue that comes up is perhaps we're going to be dealing with different suppliers, and that's really going to be the case, is we're worried about these different suppliers because you're ending up where you have a problem where, if you have two quantities of produce and, one is going to be chulin and one is going to be tevel, you can't tithe for this, for that. You can't tithe tevel for chulin. You can't tithe chulin for tevel. And even in a case of Demai bread or Demai piles of grain, and you're getting it now from multiple suppliers, you might end up where you actually have the right to tevel in there, and you can't separate tithes from this one for that one. You're not allowed to. And that's going to be the depth of what's going on here and the beauty of what's going on here. And part of the problem is we don't know for sure whether these are all going to be tevel or chulin or some of each, because you might be dealing with different suppliers. The Mishnah says, one who buys bread from a baker. Now, it should be known that we're talking about a baker who is an Am Haaretz, or to a haver who's going to be exempt from tithing because he's going to be selling a large quantity. And this came up earlier here. So there's a lot of people like the Chazan Ish who are going to specify this is actually talking about an Am Haaretz baker, but we know that also a haver is going to be exempt from tithing if he sells a large quantity in wholesale. So it could be either, and you could look at it as either just a regular Am Haaretz baker or a haver who is selling wholesale to many guys who will take. They're called palters. They'll buy bread and then go and sell it individually, and you see that even today, still in the old city in Jerusalem, where Arabs will buy bread from a baker, and then they'll try to sell the individual loaves and pastries in carts all around the old city. And that's how it used to be done. So that kind of baker, if that were to be a Jew and a haver, that would be a case where he's selling large quantities of wholesale, and this would also apply to him. So Mishnah says, one who buys bread from a baker may separate tithes from hot loaves for cold loaves, or from cold loaves for hot ones. Now, this is Mishnaic writing, and really what this is saying, says the Rosh, is that the term warm bread means not that it came from an oven. It really means that it came today. It came from, today's work, and it's made today. And the cold bread means that it came from yesterday, or, as we're going to see Rabbi Meir said, within the last 30 days. This is not produced today. And again, this is Mishnaic term for being bread of different days. And the Mishnah is going to refine this even more, and it's going to say even if the loaves came from many different molds. Now, some people are going to understand this as literally as a mold, and some people are going to understand this as a different oven, but let's talk about it in terms of actual different molds. And diffuse is going to mean a form or a mold. And Rabbi Meir is not worried that yesterday's cold bread was baked with grain from one supplier, while today's hot bread was made from grain from a different supplier. And if such were the case, the two sets of bread would have to be tithed separately, because it's not possible for one supplier's grain where that was tithed while the other was not. Now, the Rosh is going to explain that Rabbi Meir is disregarding this possibility because he's assuming that the baker uses the same supplier on a regular basis. And again, that's really what this whole issue is going to be about, is where did you get the supply of this flour? And ultimately, what's going to be coming up with these many different molds, in other words, different shapes, ultimately is going to be Rabbi Shimon's opinion that perhaps each of these different molds needs a different supplier because you're making a different kind of confectionery. So over here, Rabbi Meir doesn't see a problem with separating Meiser from the hot for the cold or vice versa. In other words, he's saying that the odds are this baker is going to be getting the same supplier day in and day out. And he doesn't have a problem if you're going to be separating out Meiser from today's bread for yesterday's bread. Again, we have a problem that if you have something that's really not alike, you can't separate this for that. Okay? The traditional example is, can you separate, olive oil for grain? No, you can't. They're different. And then it gets more refined. Can you separate olives for olive oil? That becomes a whole maloket in Maseket Trumos. But the point is that you have issues that come up with things that are dissimilar. And what the Gemara is going to be asking is this going to be enough where now you have different suppliers, and these suppliers can be Amaratzim, and maybe the produce is definite tevel, and maybe this other confection and this other mold is not definite tevel. What are you going to do now if you're buying a few different loaves, and even if it's going to be from the same baker, now you have maybe different bread. Some is from today, some is from yesterday, some is from this kind of confectionery, and some is that kind of confectionery. Maybe there's different suppliers because, as Rabbi Meir is going to be saying, that different confectionaries require different kinds of flour, and that might be supplied by somebody else. So over here, Rabbi Meir is going to basically be assuming that this all comes from one source. Now, when we're doing this example of tithing cold bread for hot bread, Rabbi Meir is trying to teach something. This, by the way, comes up in Bavli Yevamos 89a. Rabbi Meir is trying to teach another point, that when you're tithing definite tevel, one should not designate the tithes from an inferior portion of the produce. This, by the way, comes up in Trumos 2:6. And however, if they did this and they did take something that was inferior for something that was good quality, it's going to be valid after the fact. But the rabbis are permitting doing this for Demai even in the beginning. In other words, because this is going to be rabbinic anyway, if you're going to take something that's not as good for something that's going to be better, it's going to be allowed. But generally speaking, you're not allowed to do that. Rabbi Meir is teaching that you have to take from the best of the tithes. The tithes are called, these tithes, the Truma Gedola, are called the first. And so we have to take, the best quality. And so really the Demai tithes for the entire batch of bread can be designated from the cold loaves, even though they would be inferior to the hot ones or the fresh ones. That's going to be the idea. So there's going to be a dissenting opinion from Rabbi Meir, and the dissenting opinion says Rabbi Yehuda prohibits taking hot or cold loaves together. And the Mishnah says, because I say that the wheat of the cold loaves that were baked yesterday was from one supplier, while the wheat of the hot loaves, which are baked today, was from another supplier. Keep in mind, what you see here is you don't see the forms, the molds being talked about. And so the Rosh is going to say that Rabbi Yehuda is disputing the presumption that a baker is going to buy from the same supplier every day. He's going to argue that wheat used in yesterday's cold bread might have come from one supplier, while the wheat used in today's bread, the hot bread, comes from a different supplier. And he's going to rule that the loaves baked on different days may not be tithed together. And again, we're going to get into this point because Rabbi Yehuda is basically saying that, look, because they came from different suppliers, this Amaretz supplier might not have tithed at all, and this Amaretz supplier that gave you, the flour for today's bread might have tithed, and then you have dissimilar things. So you can't tithe for something that's doraita tevel, for something that's going to be derabanan, where it's already had truma meiser, truma gadola taken out. So, and by the way, the Am Haaretz might have had all the tithes taken out. And then you have another problem. You can't take tithes. You can't do tithes on something that's already been tithed for something that's not been tithed. That is also very dissimilar. We get a third opinion. And the third opinion is also going to be really worrying about this other supplier. Rabbi Shimon prohibits tithing loaves together with respect to Trumas Meiser, but he permits it with respect to challah. Now, he's basically going to be saying that Rabbi Shimon is going to be more stringent than Rabbi Yehuda, and they're going to define that. And he's basically saying that Rabbi Shimon is singling out here Truma Meiser, and he's not mentioning the Meiser Sheni, which must also be separated from Demai and designated and redeemed. So, let me read this again. Rabbi Shimon prohibits tithing loaves together with respect to Trumas Meiser, but prohibits doing so with respect to challah. So the third tithe is mentioned, the fifth tithe is mentioned, but the fourth tithe, that's going to be Meiser Sheni, that's not mentioned here. So the Chazan Ish in 12.5, Demai 12.5, is going to explain why Rabbi Shimon is going to single out Trumas Meiser and not mention Meiser Sheni, and why that also still has to be separated from Demai and designated and redeemed. So the challah, although the Meiser can't be separated from all loaves together, according to Rabbi Shimon, because some of the suppliers might have already separated out Meiser. And this is not going to be a problem with Rabbi Shimon's formulation for challah. Why is that going to be? The Rosh is going to explain this, and he's going to say that the challah obligation does not take effect until the dough is kneaded, and this process is performed on all the loaves by one person. That's going to be the baker. So either he tithed them all or he tithed none of them. And since they're going to be uniform in the tithing status, we're going to see it as uniform, and we're going to be able to look at it with respect to challah. And consequently, Rabbi Shimon, says the Rosh, is going to be ruling that challah may be separated from all the loaves together. And again, why can you separate all the loaves together? Because normally when a single baker is doing this, he's going to tithe all the loaves together. And so the idea is going to be that they're not going to be dissimilar. So some of the tithes you're going to take out for Demai, but these other tithes, like challah, you're gonna take all of it out together because you're gonna assume that he didn't take out any of the challah. And again, Rabbi Shimon prohibits tithing loaves together with respect to Trumas Meiser. So he's going to be saying that perhaps the flour came from different places, different suppliers. And so again, when you're going to try to separate out Truma Meiser, you're going to have a problem because now again you have this problem of dissimilar suppliers, and this one that came from this supplier might have had no tithes taken out, and this one might have been fully tithed. And this other supplier might have had where it's partially tithed and just the Truma Gadola is taken out. So then you would have three different suppliers and three different sets of problems. So he's going to say, because you have the possibility of so many suppliers, with respect to Truma Meiser, you can't tithe all the loaves together. So one of the ways to look at this is going to be through the lens of Demai, and to look at it in terms of, being sensitive in terms of the derabanan aspect of this bread. In other words, this also could be a concern for Tevel, but really this is located in Maseket Demai, and we're worried about an Am Haaretz dealing with tithes on this. But this is still instructive on how to look at it in terms of if somebody were tithing and even if they were haver, but getting supplies from different locations. So you might have a problem where some of it might still be tevel and some of it might not be, and these teachings would still be relevant. The Gemara now is going to get into Rabbi Meir's ruling and dig into Rabbi Meir's ruling that the Mishnah may Mishnah is saying that one can separate tithes from a previous cold bread for the hot bread and vice versa, and that's going to be because, says Rabbi Meir, the wheat from both sets of bread is probably going to come from the same supplier. That's a very lenient opinion. Let's get into it. The Gemara says, how far back in time can the cold bread have been made? And we're going to still assume that it came from the same supplier of wheat as today's hot bread. And the disciples of Rabbi Hiya say in the name of Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, until 30 days. Again, this is not the opinion of Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. They're trying to understand what is Rabbi Meir saying. And again, in Judaism, when you look at Judaism, you really want to try to see what is the Tanaic source. What are the Tanaim saying? You really want to dig into it, even if that's not the halacha l'maisa, because part of it might be the halacha l'maisa when the temple is rebuilt. So it's worth trying to understand. Some of the stuff might be the law today when we're in Gullus, and some might be the halacha both when the temple was standing and when it will stand again. Very important to look at that. So the disciples of Rabbi Hiya says in the name of Rabbi Yeshua until 30 days. In other words, they're going to say, says Amara Fulda, that any loaves bought at the same baker within a period of 30 days may be tithed together. Why? Because they're going to assume that it came from the same supplier. The baker's probably not going to be changing suppliers. The Gemara is going to explain what is the case. And they're going to say one bought loaves of bread from the baker at the beginning of 30 days, in the middle of 30 days, and at the end of 30 days. And the loaves purchased first with those purchased second are one group. And those purchased second with those purchased third are one group. But those purchased first and those purchased thirds are two groups. So the Marafuld is explaining when Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi is saying until 30 days, he did not mean to include the 30th day itself. Really, he's saying if somebody brought loaves of bread on the first day of the 30th day period, Rabbi Meir would be saying, according to Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, that we must be concerned that perhaps each set of loaves might have originated with a different supplier, and in which case you would have to set the tithes separately. You can't tithe everything together. You have to do tithes individually. Well, so the Mishnah is going to state that Rabbi Shimon is going to prohibit tithing loaves together with respect to Trumas Meiser, but is going to allow it with respect to challah. Now, I want to explain this with the Pnei Moshe for a second. Rabbi Shimon is making a distinction, and that's going to be a ruling that tithing loaves together is forbidden, asur, not allowed, in the case of Trumas Meiser. But it's allowed regarding challah. Now, Rabbi Yehuda, who's also a Tana, did not make any kind of distinction like this. He's going to basically be holding that a single separation is invalid even for challah. That's going to be the background. So the Gemara asks a question, it says, but how can Rabbi Yehuda prohibit a single separation of challah? Does it not become tevel when with one baker, with the baker? In other words, what this is asking, says Pnei Moshe, is that the wheat does not become tevel with respect to challah until the flour is kneaded. And that, by the way, has to be done with the baker mixing the flour and water. So even if, says the Pnei Moshe, the baker received the wheat from many sources, the idea is that he alone is responsible for separating the challah from all the loaves. And he's basically implying that there's no reason to fear that the challah was separated from some of the loaves and not from other loaves. Why? Because there's one source, one person has control over it. Either the guy is separating challah or he's not. So, and by the way, either he's separating them from all of them or he's separating it from none of them. So if the buyer is going to be separating challah from one set of loaves for another, either hot or cold, he would not be separating challah from that which is obligated in challah for that which is exempt and vice versa. So why would Rabbi Yehuda forbid him to do it? So again, if these have all been separated, then and now you have today's bread and yesterday's bread. Well, if these ones have been separated and those ones haven't, and it's all done by the same baker, Rabbi Yehuda is basically saying, well, again, these are dissimilar. This is like, this is like trying to do separations for olive oil on grain. You can't. It's too dissimilar. Why? Because this one's had the challah taken out and this one hasn't. Rabbi Yehuda is basically saying, look, either when you're buying from the baker, either he separated out all of the challah or he didn't. And really, Rabbi Yehuda is basically going to be holding that, again, in this Mishnah, he's going to prohibit tithing hot or cold loaves together. And he's going to say, but that the wheat of the cold loaves, which are baked yesterday, was from one supplier, while the wheat of the hot bread, which is baked today, comes from another supplier. So, in other words, that's going to be why you can't tithe the two together. But in terms of separating challah together, either whether this has been tithed or not, we're talking about the challah portion. Either he's going to tithe all of the challah or he's not. So the Gemara is going to wonder about this question. Okay, here's the question. The question is going to be, if the buyer separated challah from one set of loaves for another, in other words, for today's for yesterday's, he would not be separating challah from that which is obligated in challah for that which is exempt and vice versa. So why is Rabbi Yehuda going to forbid this? Gemara answers, and it's going to say, this by the way is going to be a very particular situation. By the way, it would be true, but it's not going to be why this is. So the Gemara is going to assert that the Mishnah refers to a particular situation, and it's going to say this refers to a baker who borrowed Demai sourdough. We're talking about an edible dough that is used only as yeast. It's used as a leavening agent, and I've tried to make sourdough starters many times, not very successfully. And really what it does is it tries to draw the natural yeast from the air, and that's going to ferment the bread, and then you're going to use that. That's what they used to use through most of the human history for yeast. The modern yeast that you have today is a very new invention. Usually it was done with sourdough. We're talking about what is normal for baking for most of human history, where somebody had sourdough starters for their yeast, and they're basically going to be borrowing Demai sourdough from an Amma Arts baker to make the dough. Now, it sounds very strange to knock on your neighbor's door and to borrow some sourdough starter, but again, this is how bread was made in most of human history. It was made with a sourdough starter. Everybody had one, and they take about a week or two to make, and then you can have it for years, except if you're a Jew, then it's chametz. But for a non-Jew, certainly it will last for years, and certainly for a Jew, you can start your sourdough starter right away after Pesach. So this is implying that this case in the Mishnah is saying where there's going to be a baker who borrowed sourdough from an Amma Arts on one day, and then he's going to borrow from a different Amma Arts on another day, and we don't know whether either Amma Arts is going to separate challah from the sourdough starter. And again, you're separating out challah from when the dough and the the flour and the water is mixed. So if you're doing a sourdough starter, you would have to take out challah for it. So Rabbi Yehuda is basically going to be forbidding the buyer to separate challah from one day's loaf for another day's loaf. Why? Because one might be obligated in challah and one might be exempt, because the source is going to be different. I know that it sounds very strange to be, thinking about sourdough and thinking about, the starters. But again, if you want yeast to rise, you gotta have yeast. If you want bread to rise, you have to have yeast. And you didn't have little packets of, quick acting yeast. That's very, very modern. And, for, the last, 100 years or 120 years, we had that. And before that, we didn't. So it wasn't, we're talking about a way that bread was normally done. And so this would be a very normal thing. Like, okay, you ran out of starter, and you're going to get starter, and now you're making bread with this other person's starter, and you don't know if challah was taken out of this bread or not, and the starter or not. The Gemara is going to reject that case, though. It's going to say, by the way, that would still be true. Now, if that were, if you were really getting the starter from someone and they didn't separate out challah from it, and then you have many sources from it, then you really do have a problem. So even though it's rejecting this as a case, halachically, that would still apply. The Gemara rejects this answer as the reason for what case this Mishnah is talking about in this particular situation, even though, by the way, that would be true. The Gemara says, even if the baker borrowed sourdough from another person, does it become tevel when it's with him? In other words, that the obligation to separate challah from the sourdough is going to be on the baker. Why? Because it's assumed that the lenders did not separate challah from them. The Amma Aretz people who were making the starter probably didn't separate challah. And the baker then is going to have to separate challah from both of these sourdoughs or from neither. So again, let's say the baker knocks on the door. He's out of sourdough starter, and he gets a little bit from this guy and a little bit from that guy. Now he has two different sets, and he's going to make challah, and he's going to make bread. Okay, and maybe one had challah separated out, and maybe one didn't. So then when the baker's getting it, the baker is going to separate challah from both the sourdoughs, or he's going to separate it neither. So in either case, whoever he's getting the starter from, if it's many people, you're going to have an equal status, and there's not going to be a problem of separating challah from that which is obligated for that which is exempt. The Gemara's problem is going to be, again, why does Rabbi Yehuda forbid separating challah from all the loaves together? He doesn't allow you to do that. So what's gonna go on? What's the answer? So the Gemara says Rabbi Yehuda refers to a baker who borrows a tamei loaf from the Amma Aretz with which to fill the oven. Now, this comes up in Masechet Challah, and bread just bakes better when you have an oven full of bread. And so the problem is that if one of the loaves is tamei, it makes all of the bread in the oven tamei. So the problem could be that the Amma Aretz doesn't have enough to fill up the oven to make good bread, and he borrows a loaf from another Amma Aretz to fill the oven. And and by the way, sometimes they're going to borrow loaves of bread to fill the oven because all the other bread that you have is going to bake bread better when the oven is full. This, by the way, comes up in Bavli Beitza 17a, talks about that. So the Gemara is also going to reject this as well as this explanation. However, that would be true if you had a tamei loaf from an Amma Aretz to fill the oven. Halachically, that would be totally true. And it would be totally true that after he baked the loaves together with the borrowed one and removed them all, that you would not be able to identify necessarily which is the borrowed loaf. And then you can't separate challah from one loaf for another because one of the loaves is the borrowed one and it might be exempt from challah. And then you have an issue. So halachically that would be true, but the Gemara says, but if that's the case where he borrowed a tamei loaf to fill the oven, the buyer must tithe each and every loaf separately, even if he bought them on the same day. Rabbi Yehuda, though, is going to require them to be tithed separately only if he bought them on different days. In other words, says Amara Fulda about this, that Rabbi Yehuda is stating that the wheat of yesterday was from one supplier, while the wheat of today is from another supplier. And this is going to imply that only separating challah from today's loaves for another of today's loaves, or of another day's loaves, are forbidden. But you can separate challah from the loaves of today for the same day. That's going to be allowed. Why? Because you got from the same source. So they're saying, says the Vilna Goan, that the current explanation of Rabbi Yehuda's view must not be this, because it would have Rabbi Yehuda holding that a single separation is forbidden even where all the loaves came out of the oven on the same day. That's not the case. But again, in terms of things that are going to be tamei and tahor, that would all be true. If a baker borrowed a tamei bread, you certainly are going to have an issue where all the bread that's going to come out is going to be tamei. And in terms of tithes, that it's going to be a question if you can take out this for that. And Rabbi Yehuda is saying that if that borrowed loaf was borrowed from today, it probably came from the same supplier of wheat, and it affects the same supplier of wheat, and you can look at it like that. And if it came from yesterday, it's going to imply that separating challah from one day's loaves for another day's loaves is not allowed. And separating only from loaves of the same day, that's what's going to be permitted. Now, the Gemara is going to discuss another approach for trying to explain Rabbi Yehuda's view. And Rabbi Yochanan is going to explain it. He's going to say, rather, it accords with Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan says elsewhere, here the situation is where one makes his dough in a state of tahara, and here the situation is one makes his dough in a state of tumah. So Rabbi Yochanan is drawing the distinction in order to solve a contradiction between here in chapter 5 of Demai, Halacha 1, and over there in Mishnah in Demai, chapter 2, Halacha 4. And we have this contradiction where, you have a baker who is an Am Haaretz, and he's going to make bread in a state of Tumah, and over there in 2:4, it's going to be where you have a Chaver baker, and he's going to be baking it in a state of Tahara. So perhaps the baker made one day's dough in a state of Tahara, separated challah from it, but he made the other day's dough in a state of Tumah. He does not separate challah. So Rabbi Yehuda is going to be ruling that challah may not be separated from the loaves of one day for the loaves of another day. And that's going to be why, because in a state of tumah, right, that if you made all the loaves tamei today, you're not going to separate out challah. Why? Because the challah is dafka not being separated out at all from any of them. Why? Because it's tamei. And you're just separating out something that has to be burnt. And then you're basically going to leave that to the buyer to separate it out, give it to the kohen to be burnt. Now, if he's doing it in a state of tahara, on the other hand, where all of the breads are going to be tahor, he's going to separate out the challah. He's going to give it to the kohen, and the kohen's going to be able to eat it. It's another thing that came up in Demai 5:1 is going to be a case where the challah that's going to be tamei has to be destroyed. It's inedible. Okay, we're going to be finishing up the chapter. The Mishnah, and Rabbi Yehuda's statement was made to solve a contradiction between these two Mishnahs over in 5:1 and 2:4. And the Gemara is gonna have his student Rabbi Elazar disagreeing with Rabbi Yochanan's solution, and the Gemara says rather it is accordance with Rabbi Elazar. For Rabbi Elazar says both the Mishnah here and the Mishnah there, it's going to be in Demai 5:1 and Demai 2:4, deal with one who makes the dough in a state of tahara. In other words, Rabbi Elazar's understanding both Mishnahs is referring to someone who makes bread in a state of tahara. And again, the difference is going to be where Rabbi Elazar is basically going to be saying that in both cases he's making tahor bread, and again, Rabbi Yochanan's view is going to be that one baker is an Am Haaretz who bakes bread that's going to be tamei, and one baker makes the bread that's going to be tahor. And if you have all tahor bread, you're going to separate out challah from it. The baker is required to separate the challah. And if it's going to be tamei bread, the court ruling that came up in 5:1 is going to be that the buyer separates out challah altogether, and the baker does not. Why? Because the baker is tamei, and the bread is tamei, and it's just inedible. The Gemara now is going to try to find a different reason with why Rabbi Yehuda is going to disagree with Rabbi Shimon with regards to challah. And it's going to be the fact that they actually are going to agree about challah, and that their dispute is actually going to be something else. So it looks like Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yehuda are disagree. In fact, they're going to agree, but the disagreement's going to be a little bit different. So Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yudan, the father of Rabbi Matanya, says, in our Mishnah, we are dealing even with a case where one made all the loaves in a state of tuma, and each one became tevel when with the baker. In other words, the baker did not borrow sourdough and didn't use a finished loaf, as the Gemara suggested, to fill the oven, both of which become tevel for challah before reaching the baker. And the Mishnah is dealing with dough that the baker himself mixes, and it becomes tevel in his domain. Okay? And basically all the loaves have the same status with regards to challah. So again, part of what we were dealing with before is, well, maybe we have a case where, with the different sourdoughs, you have a different dissimilarity where you're not gonna be able to tithe this for that. Again, you can't separate something that's dissimilar for something that's also dissimilar. And in the case where you've had challah already taken out of one and not taken out of the other, you can't separate, this bread for that bread. Not allowed because they're not the same. So the Gemara is saying that each one is made in tevel with the baker, and the loaves are going to have the same status in challah. And even Rabbi Yehuda is going to agree that the challah may be separated from any loaf from all the other loaves. And the dispute between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon is actually not going to be about this. And the Gemara is going to explain this. It's going to say, it was taught in Brisa, Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon prohibit taking loaves together with respect to Trumas Meiser. Again, that's the key point. We're talking about Trumas Meiser here. That's the chiddush, the novelty that Rabbi Shimon had. And this Brisa says Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon prohibit tithing loaves together with respect to Trumas Meiser, but they do allow doing so with respect to challah. Now the Brisa is going to state explicitly that Rabbi Yehuda agrees with Rabbi Shimon on the challah. So that's going to establish this point about the challah. So what's the point of dispute between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon? The Gemara says, now Rabbi Yehuda prohibits taking loaves together with respect to Trumas Meiser, but allows it with respect to challah. And Rabbi Shimon prohibits tithing loaves together with respect to Trumas Meiser, but he allows this with respect to challah. So what is the difference between them? The Gemara is going to answer that. According to Rabbi Yehuda, he, the buyer, may not take tithes from the loaves he bought today for the loaves he bought yesterday, or from the loaves he bought yesterday for the loaves he bought today. And why is that? Because he's worried about, what's coming up. The Gemara says, but he may take tithes from the loaves of one type of oven, in other words, one kind of mold, for the loaves of another kind of oven or another kind of mold. And according to Rabbi Shimon, he may not take tithes even from the loaves of one type of oven for the loaves of another kind of oven. So according to Rabbi Shimon, the flour that's going to be used in the different kind of molds, again, they're using oven and mold interchangeably here, but you're basically concerning yourself with some way of producing different kinds of confectionaries. Either you have an oven and everything in this oven is going to be one kind of confectionery, or you have a mold where this mold makes different kind of confectionaries. But the point is, it's dafka, a different product. So when you go to a baker, sometimes you'll see danishes, and sometimes you'll see croissants, and sometimes you'll see all sorts of fancy flour desserts, pastries that are there. They're all different. And that's what Rabbi Shimon is talking about. And that's what they're talking about. They're saying that, if you're going to fill the oven and you're only going to make croissants, that's one thing. Or a mold that makes this fancy kind of confectionery, that's another thing. And according to Rabbi Shimon is basically going to be saying that each of these different kinds of confectionaries requires a different kind of grade of wheat. And that means it has to come from a different supplier. And then you get back to this same problem. So even if it's made the same day, that you have, the danishes have to be like this, and this fancy dessert has to be like that. You're not using the same flour. It means it came from a different supplier, even if it's made the same day. Even if you did all the same stuff with separations and things like that in terms of everything except for the challah. Rabbi Shimon allows you to take the challah because he's saying, look, either you did or you didn't take the challah. But in terms of these different confectionaries that came from different suppliers, even if you're making it the same day, well, if you're taking from the croissant guy, I don't know if he took out, Trumas Meiser from that flour. And this guy who's making the danishes over here, even though you're making it the same day for your bakery or your commercial, bake shop, well, this kind of different grade of flour, this is going to be something where perhaps it's actually dafka tevel. Maybe the guy's an Amaretz, he doesn't separate any ties. So you can't take out ties for the danishes on behalf of the croissants because they're dissimilar. That's the point of Rabbi Shimon, because the suppliers are different. Now, according to Rabbi Yehuda is basically saying, and again, oven is used to mean mold, but why is it using the word oven? Because again, you could have a single production of danishes in an oven, and you're doing all the danishes in one day. That would be like a mold, right? It's really trying to signify that all the danishes that you made today are here in this oven or this mold. It's all the danishes, okay? And they're not different danishes from 2 weeks ago, all right? So basically what it's saying that all the loaves or danishes or croissants that are baked, according to Rabbi Yehuda, on a single day are presumably going to come from a single supplier, and even if the loaves are a different form. In other words, he's saying that even if you have croissants and you have danishes, that you probably got the flour from the same baker, from the same supplier. And so that's why he's going to be saying that you're going to be able to separate out the tithes that you had today, but not from yesterday. Why not from yesterday? Because maybe yesterday you were making something else and you have a different supplier. And over here, if the loaves are baked on 2 different days, it might have come from 2 different suppliers. So by the way, even if it's going to be danishes today and danishes from last week, the Rabbi Yehuda is basically going to be saying that, well, maybe today's danishes came from a different supplier from the one last week. And you can't assume that the same flour is the same. And that's why it's going to be dissimilar. They're both going to agree that, okay, with regards to challah, sure, you can separate out the challah. But they're both going to be having this issue about the day. Which day can you do on the Truma Meiser? Rabbi Shimon is saying if you're doing from these different ones for the danish on behalf of the croissant on this day, because it might have come from 2 different suppliers, you can't do that. But you can take out for today all of the challah for the danishes for the croissant today, but you can't take out Truma Meiser. Rabbi Yehuda is coming and he is saying that you can take out the challah today on behalf of the danishes for the half of the croissants, but if you have from yesterday you have danishes and today you have danishes, you can't separate out Truma Meiser from those danishes to these danishes because it might have come from 2 different suppliers. And the problem is when you're coming up with 2 different suppliers, that's what everybody agrees about. Everybody agrees that if it comes from 2 different suppliers, Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Shimon is agreeing, and that it comes from 2 different suppliers, everybody agrees that you can't do tithes for Truma Meiser on behalf of this one for that one, because this one might really be tevel, and that one over here might have been tithed fully, or it might have been partially tithed. And that's going to be the point. So you have a few different moving parts. One of the moving parts that's coming up is what happens if it's tamei and tahor, what happens about the challah separation, and what happens between today and yesterday, even up to 30 days, according to Rabbi Meir's opinion, and what happens with different confectionaries. So, you have these 4 moving parts, And that's why this is really like a multifaceted diamond, and really is a very beautiful, really beautiful way to try to understand this. Have a great day.